Chapter 12. Dueling Heart versus Dueling Heart. Almost as soon as Jen and her group had made their decision, Jack stepped forward and made an announcement. "It's time to move on to the semifinal round," he said, "and for that I have something special for all of you." He walked excitedly to the front door of the dojo, motioning for the other occupants of his building to follow him as he stepped outside. They all did, Jen and the other visitors to the dojo moving more hesitantly than those who were regulars. Once everyone was standing together in the parking lot of the building, Jack gestured to the raised section of the lot that Jen had noticed when she and her companions had first arrived, and suddenly it occurred to Jen what it was for. "The final few heart-to-hearts," Jack explained, "will be fought in my outdoor arena. Out here, there isn't any risk of damaging the building. You can really cut loose." Jen and Sarah traded looks. The arena was less than 100 feet from the building and not much further away from the road, which was still bustling with cars. If practically any member of the Dueling Hearts, or of Karen's group, were to really cut loose in a battle with someone else of similar skill in that arena, the dojo would almost definitely become collateral damage. The road might as well. Apparently Rocky felt the same way, because Jen saw him roll his eyes and shake his head in response to Jack's statement. Granted, assuming that she was careful, Sarah could open up a bit more out here than she'd been able to inside, but she would absolutely have to continue to limit herself. Jen, at least, wouldn't have to. She was an exception amongst her peers. None of her techniques were quite so destructive. Having a larger area to move around in could benefit her, too. "The next heart-to-heart is between two of our visitors," Jack announced. "Jen and Sarah, who entered under the umbrella of Team Dueling Hearts. Will you please make your way up to the arena?" Sarah cracked her neck and her knuckles, and she and Jen jumped effortlessly 7 feet upward to land upon the raised section of asphalt. They walked to different ends of what Jen estimated to be a space of roughly 35 square feet. As they faced off, Jen noticed that Rocky was giving both of them his renewed full attention. She got the sense that he hadn't expected either of them to make it this far. She barely even had time to register that, though. Jen was about to fight another member of her team. This had her genuinely worried because, simply put, the other Dueling Hearts were stronger than her. She thought it possible, and likely, that she had the stronger strategic mind, and she could certainly predict the majority of any of her allies' techniques. But Sarah, while not being as observant or as strong a strategist, also knew enough of Jen's fighting style that her stronger fighting instincts would make up the difference. If Jen really cranked up her soul and lowered her personal gravity as much as she could with her current level of training, and she made good use of her sixth sense, she might be able to keep up with Sarah even with her life from the earth technique active. But she wouldn't have time to increase her weight back to normal while attacking, and at such a low weight, her strikes would be about as substantial as a plastic bag smacking someone in the face. All of this went through Jen's mind in the second or so that it took Jack to find a spot where he could see most of the arena. He declared the start of the match immediately, and yet, for a long several seconds, Jen and Sarah didn't move. Occasionally their muscles would twitch as if they might, but they never did. Their eyes were locked, the two of them waging a mental battle, each of them agonizing over which first move to make, knowing full well that any move they made ran the risk of being immediately countered by their opponent. Finally, after nearly a full minute of doing nothing but sizing her opponent up, it was Sarah who made the first move. "Screw it," she said, and she rushed forward. She moved with the grace of a ballerina, her head down, her arms held close to her sides. She danced in close to her opponent, turning in tight circles, shifting from heel to toe in rapid succession. With each turn she lashed out, putting the momentum of her spins behind her strikes, compensating for her lack of raw physical power. She circled Jen rapidly, moving from place to place so quickly that she almost seemed to be teleporting. Jen was almost caught off guard. She'd been expecting Sarah to fight the way she always had. She hadn't seen Sarah fight all out since her second heart-to-heart with Monty, where she'd finally learned to call upon her life energy. Jen, embarrassingly, hadn't considered that, now that Sarah could use that life energy to replenish her soul, she might be more liberal with it. Despite her surprise, though, Jen still knew Sarah's fighting style well enough that she was able to avoid taking a hit. Jen focused and reached out with her life energy, extending her sixth sense. Suddenly, she could perceive Sarah's movements without having to see her. This let her split focus between avoiding Sarah's attacks and preparing a counterattack. She mixed her energies on the fly, wrapping herself in her soft purple soul. Her own personal gravity decreased, allowing her to move much more quickly and freely. She ducked under Sarah's latest strike and spun suddenly in place, trying to sweep Sarah's feet out from under her, but Sarah jumped up and over Jen's attack, not realizing that this is what Jen wanted to happen. Jen sent soul into her hand and thrust her palm at Sarah's chest. Hanging in the air, Sarah couldn't avoid the strike. It wouldn't do much damage, but Jen could use it to pass some of her soul into Sarah, invert it, and make Sarah heavier and slower to move. It would have worked, too, but Sarah surprised Jen when she reached out and grabbed Jen's arm, passed her thrusting hand, and yanked herself clear past Jen's strike. She swung at Jen's jaw, and Jen was barely able to duck out of the way, leaping back, putting some distance between herself and her opponent. Jen marveled at Sarah's counter. It was a risky, no guarantees kind of defense, and even more so, it was the kind of move that Jen would never make. It illustrated the real difference between Jen and her cousin. Sarah had realized what Jen was trying to do, and even though Jen could have conceivably transferred her soul through any part of her body, Sarah had made the snap assumption that, if Jen intended to make the transfer through her hand, she wouldn't be able to do so with the rest of her arm at the same time. Jen might have come to the same conclusion in Sarah's place, but she would have needed an extra moment to consider the risk, and the chance would have passed her by completely. As Jen recovered her footing and Sarah landed again several feet away, Jen realized that she had to expand her way of thinking. If she was going to win this heart-to-heart, she was going to have to either find a way to anticipate every reckless move that her cousin might make, or she would have to learn to take chances with no logical guarantee of success. The latter option seemed marginally more possible, though that didn't mean it would be easy. Jen mixed her energies again, replenishing the small amount of soul that she had used up and lowering her own personal gravity as much as she could. When Sarah renewed her attack, Jen jumped as hard as she could. She shot like a bullet into the air. She could hear several of the spectators gasp as she sailed upward over 50 feet, and then seemed to hang there, falling incredibly slowly. Below her, Sarah scowled and blew a raspberry up at her cousin. Jen rolled her eyes, but otherwise ignored her, taking the time that she'd bought herself to send her soul out into the air. She concentrated, molding that soul into several soft purple orbs that orbited her at chest level. Her plan was to throw her weight, spin in place, and scoop up each orb in succession, throwing them all rapidly, increasing her chance of scoring a hit. Before she could, though, she saw Sarah gesture upward with both hands. Suddenly the arena became overcast. Distorted light rippled across the ground. Jen recognized it as light seen through water, and she realized what Sarah was doing. Jen did throw her weight and spin in place, but only 180 degrees to face the net of water that Sarah had summoned at Jen's back. Below her, the spectators stared in awe at Sarah's display of impressive power and even more impressive control. The sheet of water moved toward Jen, meaning to scoop her up and freeze her in place. Taking a chance, allowing herself to act totally on instinct, Jen snatched up one of her soul orbs and tossed it, clenching her fist as the orb came in contact with the water. The orb exploded outward, disrupting the soul holding the sheet of water together, blasting a hole open in its center just long enough for Jen to slip through it as the sheet of water passed by her. Unfortunately, it swept up her other orbs and dispersed them in turn. Jen threw her weight again and turned back to face Sarah, ready to react to whatever follow-up her cousin had prepared. As she did, and even as the water net splattered across the ground, Sarah forced her soul and her life energy to mix, holding them together for as long as she could stand, counting on her expert level of control to keep the huge amounts of soul that she generated from going crazy and burning her out. She cried out in pain and frustration as she reeled that energy in. Even more of the vapor from the air, and the water from her water net, flowed toward her and collected around her feet. It coiled like a liquid snake, creating a platform beneath her, lifted her up, and tossed her at Jen like a rocket. Her water followed her fist as she drew it back, aiming to punch Jen right out of the sky. A portion of it even coiled around her fingers and froze, forming her icy iron knuckles. Jen, thinking fast, reversed the polarity of the soul that clung to her, increasing the pull of gravity on her body rather than lessening it. She dropped like a stone, Sarah's attack passing right over her. She inverted her energies again, inches from the ground, landing softly, and then dispersed her energy altogether. Next, she forced her soul and her life energy to mix again as she pulled the stubby length of wood from her pocket. Sarah did a flip above Jen and dropped toward the opposite end of the arena, her water coiling beneath her as she landed to cushion her fall. She lunged again, but before she could get in close, Jen's staff sprung to its full standard length of between 6 and 7 feet. Jen thrust the staff toward the advancing Sarah, startling her into a brief retreat. Once she overcame the initial surprise of seeing the weapon appear so suddenly, she renewed her assault, though now things were a little more even. With the added reach of the staff, Jen was able to not only keep Sarah at bay, but even return the favor. The two of them clashed for a while, attacking and counterattacking, blocking and dodging, moving throughout the entire arena. They seemed evenly matched, and it didn't take Sarah long to get annoyed with that. Displaying some of the trademark seer stubbornness, she stood her ground. Jen thrust the end of her staff right at Sarah's gut, knocking her back, but she endured, reached out, and grabbed onto it. Much as she had earlier when she had grabbed onto Jen's arm, Sarah pulled on the staff, leveraging herself up beside it. Despite the staff being significantly harder than steel, she pumped extra soul into her knee and thrust upward, snapping the staff in half almost exactly. Sarah snatched up the severed half of the staff and wielded it like a club, turning on her heel and swinging it where Jen had been only moments before, hitting the air. Jen was gone, and Sarah was surprised to see that she had lowered her own personal gravity again, returning to the air. It made sense that she would move, but why try this trick again when it hadn't worked last time? That's when Sarah felt the weapon in her hand begin to vibrate. She didn't know why it was vibrating. She didn't realize that Jen had realized what Sarah was planning to do, purposefully causing an imbalance between the soul and the life energy in the soon-to-be severed piece. Those energies were going out of control, and while a fighter who found themselves in that situation could expel the excess energy from their body, likely doing so on reflex, burning themselves out but suffering no serious harm, the wood of the staff couldn't. The energies within continued to clash out of control. In less than a second, it would explode. Even though Sarah didn't know exactly what was happening, she did react. Her instincts kicked in, and she tossed the length of wood and snatched it out of the air with the water that was still orbiting her. Her water froze just in time to cushion the explosion, though the force of it shattered the ice and sent chunks of it flying in every direction like shrapnel. Sarah defended against it, deflecting as much of it as she could with her soul, but a piece still lodged itself in her arm, and another cut her cheek. Jen fell once again from the sky, standing opposite Sarah. She brandished what was left of her staff, and it grew again to combat length. Sarah, meanwhile, pulled the small shard of ice from her arm and tossed it into the air. She gestured, and it hung there, while she bent down and touched the ground, declaring, "Life from the earth." Jen could feel energy pour forth from the ground below and into her cousin, where Sarah channeled it into her pool of remaining soul and amplified it. Her entire body was wreathed in a golden glow, and her injuries healed immediately. She gestured, and all of the shards of ice rose into the air to join the one that she had removed from her arm. They melted again, pooling in the air above Sarah's head. Jen felt the air around her become noticeably drier as Sarah drew even more moisture from it. Trees spanning the nearby length of highway wilted as moisture flowed from them. The volume of water that hung above Sarah's head continued to grow. Alongside the arena, several of the spectators took a few steps back. The only ones who didn't feel the need to do so were Mina, Rocky, and the rest of Jen's little group. Jen crunched the numbers in her head. She had managed to get Sarah to talk about her final fight with Monty enough times over the past 2 months that she knew the gist of this technique. If she tried to get close to Sarah, she would be more likely to be hit, but if she kept her distance, her lack of effective ranged options would make it almost impossible to turn the tables before she was completely worn out. She could try to force Sarah to deplete the energy from her life from the earth, exhausting her, but the chances of that happening while Jen still had the strength to fight, even if she budgeted her stamina carefully, were slim. Still, if she made use of her other new technique, she might be able to pull it off and score a definitive win. This was supposed to be a chance for her to try new tactics, so it made sense to take the chance. All of this passed through Jen's mind in the half-second that it took for Sarah to finally execute her technique. "Water cannon," she declared, and high-pressure sprays of water burst forth from the pools suspended in the air, one after another in quick succession. Jen mixed her energies again and wrapped herself in the soft purple light of her soul. She lowered her personal gravity and zipped rapidly back and forth throughout her half-realized space, flickering in and out of view, avoiding the blasts by the skin of her teeth. Whenever they missed her, they struck the ground beneath her feet, shearing large chunks out of the asphalt, making the terrain more hazardous and giving Jen one more thing to worry about. The two dueling hearts could hear Jack freaking out a bit over the damage, but Sarah didn't stop. She was on a roll. She lashed out with her streams of water faster and faster until finally, Jen misjudged, barely, and was clipped by one of the blasts. She felt her soul diminish as it defended her from the attack, taking a portion of her stamina with it. She stumbled over a rough section of asphalt and fell to one knee, but she braced herself with her staff to keep from falling any further. Seeing a chance, Sarah held her hands up and clenched her fists. The pool of suspended water split into smaller pools that condensed immediately into chunks of ice. Sarah pointed at Jen and declared, through gritted teeth, "Crystal downpour." All of that ice dropped toward Jen. Any one chunk had the potential to knock her out of bounds, assuming it didn't just knock her out outright. Jen pushed herself back to her feet. As the crystal downpour neared her, she twirled her staff and spun in place, much as she had against Ray, deflecting one chunk of ice after another. She was able to deflect them all, but these impacts were significantly greater than the impacts of Ray's technique. By the time Sarah let up, her ammunition nearly expended, Jen was breathing heavily, so tired that she fell back to her knee. Even now, Sarah didn't relent. Her opponent wasn't down yet, and she intended to change that. She reached up, and the few remaining chunks of ice melted and flowed toward her hand and froze into Sarah's icy blade, which she snatched out of the air as she surged forward so fast that the air compressed in front of her fast enough to go pop. Jen stumbled back to her feet and defended again with her staff, engaging her cousin in an intense flurry of thrusts, swipes, and parries. Again, the greater reach of Jen's weapon aided her at keeping her opponent at bay. Realizing that she would have to take a risk to make her plan work, Jen did just that. She overreached and strained, knocking Sarah's blade wide, exposing her torso. Straining further, she recovered her footing. She pointed the end of her staff at Sarah and sent life energy into it, willing it to grow, meaning to push her cousin out of bounds as she had Ray, but Sarah was too quick for that. She banked to the side and twisted on her heel, and the staff grew right past her. This time, she didn't break off a piece. Instead, she kicked the staff upward as hard as she could. As long as Jen had made it, the staff was more difficult than normal to control, so Sarah expected that knocking it so wide would lock out Jen's defenses long enough for her to get in close and finish things off with her sword. She lunged in close to Jen, unaware that Jen had anticipated this possibility. Just as she had at the end of her fight with Ray, Jen dissolved the extra length of her staff, restoring full control of it in an instant. It sprang back to combat length, and she lashed out with it, its end striking the incoming tip of Sarah's blade. Energy crackled from the point of impact, spreading out like a shockwave. The blade was deflected wide, while Jen's staff ricocheted inward. Suddenly, Sarah found herself well inside the reach of her opponent's weapon, with no good means to deflect it. Without even realizing it, she followed Jen's example, dissolving her own weapon so she could make better use of it. It melted, and she pooled the resulting liquid around her arms, crossing them over her chest. The water condensed, rushing to shield its wielder, but it didn't have enough time to fully solidify. Jen's staff struck it, and it shattered easily. The strike carried through and pushed Sarah back. She stumbled, her own breathing growing heavy too now, but she was still in better shape than her opponent. She held out her hand, reaching out once again with her soul. She was running low, and while she had the ability to generate more, she wasn't practiced at doing it on the fly. Still, she had enough soul left to recall the pieces of her sword, along with a good glug of the water still coating the arena. It stretched out, long and thin, until it was longer than Sarah was tall, freezing in time for her to grip it at its middle. "There," Sarah said, panting. "Now I have a staff of my own." Sarah lunged forward again, much slower this time, though that didn't mean much since Jen wasn't able to move at full speed either. Frustratingly, even after everything Jen had put her through, Sarah was still faster than her cousin, and now that she wielded a weapon with the same reach as Jen's, getting inside Jen's defenses was inevitable. Jen did her best, but she never came close to hitting her opponent, and though she made Sarah work for it, she took one hit and then another to her arm and her knee. She lost her footing and fell sprawled on the asphalt. Sarah stumbled back from her, propping herself up with her new staff, her breathing even more labored now than before. Jack stood, mouth agape, at the sidelines. He had never seen such an intense display of soul techniques in person. Thankfully, he was still on top of things enough that he began the count almost immediately. As he did so, Jen fished around in her pocket again. This time, though, rather than a new weapon, she drew a single seed, like an apple seed, except that it gave off a faint golden glow. This was the tool needed to initiate Jen's other new technique, and this was as good a time for it as any. She placed it between her teeth and bit down, breaking its shell. Instantly, she was wrapped in a fainter version of the same halo of golden light that Sarah had gained after using life from the earth. Though her injuries didn't disappear completely, they did lessen by quite a bit, and Jen was able to rise again, almost completely rejuvenated, by the count of 6. Sarah gawked at her cousin. "What did you do?" she asked. "I used another of the techniques I've been developing," Jen answered, trying not to beam. "It's a way to get around the fact that I haven't been able to master life from the earth yet. I take a seed, and I transfer a little bit of life energy to it and store it there multiple times throughout the day. I can press it down as much as I can, and then, when I need it, I can break the seed and release it all at once, reabsorbing it and rejuvenating myself. Right now, she explained, it takes about a week to fill a single one of these healing seeds with as much as it can hold, and since I only developed the technique 2 weeks ago, I've only been able to make 2 so far. But I think that if I practice enough, I can reduce that time down to as little as a day. Sarah shook her head. Damn it, you're really amazing. This is exactly why I was so worried about fighting you today. You planned all this out, didn't you? The whole last exchange, you drew it out as much as you could so I'd use up enough of my life from the earth that, when you used that seed, it'd give you the clear advantage. That's right, Jen admitted. It was a risk. You were really liberal with your energy because you didn't know about the healing seed. If you had, you would have used your energy more sparingly and things wouldn't have turned out like this. Things would still be up in the air. Sarah smirked at her cousin. Don't think this is over just because you have way more soul left than me. I'm used to fighting with less soul than others. I'm not going to just roll over. Jen smiled. I didn't expect you to. Without another word, the 2 girls charged toward each other again, weapons in hand, and renewed their deadly dance. This time, though, things were a little different. This time it was Sarah who couldn't keep up. She pushed herself, keeping her opponent at bay, but the tables really had turned. Now it was Sarah who had to strain just to defend, and who didn't have the speed or the strength to counter. The exchange continued for a few more minutes while Jen played things safe, using as little stamina as she could manage while forcing her opponent to overextend wherever she could. Jen began to worry, if only a second, as the boost that she'd received from her technique began to wane, but almost as soon as it did, Sarah stumbled. Jen seized her chance, knocking Sarah's staff wide, surging inside her guard and elbowing her in the chest. She twisted in place, a driving knee into Sarah's stomach, knocking her back, then spun and brandished her staff, bashing Sarah in the hand and knocking her weapon away. She spun again, swinging her staff at Sarah's head this time. Sarah raised her arm, absorbing most of the blow, but she was still knocked off of her feet. Jack started counting again. Jen stepped back, twirling her staff into a ready position under her arm and along her back. Against most opponents, her last attack would have been enough to end the fight. But Sarah wasn't most opponents. By the count of 6, she was struggling to rise, and by the count of 9, she was back on her feet. Jack stopped counting and declared that the fight would continue. As soon as it did, Sarah held her arms close to her sides and charged forward. Jen thrust with her staff, and Sarah turned on her heels, avoiding the strike, but Jen had anticipated her defense. She shuffled back and swept her staff across the other dueling heart's path. Sarah jumped up to avoid being tripped and raised her fist to strike, but Jen stepped back further and tipped her staff, pointing one end at Sarah's torso and bracing the other against the ground. Jen transferred as much energy as she could still spare into the staff, and it extended. Unable to move herself while in the air, Sarah was caught in the stomach and launched upward. She reached out to grab the staff, but as she did, Jen willed her energy back out of it, and all but the original stubby length of wood dissolved down to dust. Sarah sailed through the air in an arc and fell out of bounds, sprawled out on the ground, defeated. Jen moved to the edge of the arena and looked down at her opponent to make sure she was okay. By way of an answer, Sarah scowled up at her cousin, flipped her off, laughed, and groaned as she picked herself up again. Jen took a deep breath and centered herself, replacing her staff in her pocket and willing her energies to mix, allowing the life energy that was generated to overflow. Then she seized hold of that energy with her will, letting her excess soul dissipate, and wrapped herself in that life energy, creating her churning golden healing aura. She felt her fatigue and her remaining injuries begin to melt away as she dropped down to Sarah's side.